I never thought I would end up in a fight with an entire development company, especially not over something I could not even see at first. But looking back now, it feels like the moment I bought that land I stepped into something already broken, something I just did not know how deep it went. My name is Evan Carter, and I live out in Willow Creek Valley, or at least I used to think of it as living, more like existing quietly on 15 acres of woods and open meadow, a small cabin near a slow-running creek. Nothing fancy, just the kind of place where the wind sounds louder than people ever do. And for a long time that was enough for me, until the day Cedar Ridge Estates showed up on the other side of the tree line. At first it felt harmless, even kind of impressive in a way. Big signs, glossy brochures, promises of luxury homes wrapped around an artificial lake, a clubhouse, tennis courts, a resort-style pool. They advertised like it was the heart of a private vacation you could live in year-round. And they kept repeating one phrase, untouched wilderness views, like they were selling nature itself, but from a safe distance. I remember thinking it was strange, but not my problem, because my land was mine, or so I believed, and the creek that ran through it had been there longer than anything else around. Cold, clean water cutting through rock and soil like it had its own memory. The first year after they broke ground, everything seemed normal enough. Just heavier trucks on the county road, some noise in the distance, nothing that reached my side of the valley. But then the second year something changed in a way I could not quite name at first. It started small, just a faint smell drifting through the trees on hot afternoons, like something organic, but wrong. And I told myself it was probably a dead animal upstream or algae blooming in the heat rural life comes with. Things like that. You learn to ignore what you cannot control. But the smell did not go away. It settled in. And then the creek itself started to look different, a slight discoloration at first, then a brownish tint that made me stop mid-step one morning because I had never seen water like that there before, not in all the years I had been on that land. I remember standing there thinking maybe I was imagining it, maybe stress, maybe I was just noticing things too closely. But the longer I watched it, the more obvious it became that something was feeding into that water, something unnatural, something steady. I followed the creek upstream that afternoon, pushing through brush, walking farther than I normally would, telling myself I would turn back once I found nothing. But I did not find nothing. I found a line of disturbance in the ground first, subtle at the beginning, then clearer, compacted soil where nothing should have been disturbed, and then I saw it, a section of pipe, partially buried, disappearing under roots and dirt like it was trying to hide from the world. I stood there for a long time just staring at it, trying to understand what I was looking at, because it was not irrigation, it was not runoff, it was something industrial, something deliberate, and when I traced its direction mentally, it did not point into the valley or toward any farm. It pointed straight through my property toward Cedar Ridge Estates. I did not want to believe it at first, because believing it meant accepting that someone had been using my land without asking, without telling me, without anything close to permission. But the more I checked, the more it made sense in the worst possible way. The pipe was part of a larger system, and it was carrying waste, real waste, not water, not drainage, but sewage. I went back to my cabin that night with dirt still on my boots and a feeling in my chest I cannot really describe, somewhere between disbelief and anger that had not fully formed yet, and I called the number I had for their property management. A man named Mark Delaney answered, calm voice, almost bored, like he had heard every complaint in the world already, and I tried to explain what I had found, tried to stay controlled, but the second I mentioned the pipe he cut me off and said it was probably an old line, something grandfathered in, nothing to worry about. And I remember laughing a little because it sounded so rehearsed, so convenient. I told him my development was not even that old, 2 years maybe, and there was nothing grandfathered about a brand new luxury estate cutting through private land. And that was when his tone shifted just slightly, not panic, more like calculation, like he was deciding how much truth he needed to admit. He said maybe there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe we could discuss compensation for inconvenience. And that word stuck with me. Inconvenience, like they were talking about a fence line or a driveway. Not what I was starting to realize might be a hidden sewage route running through my creek. I told him I was not interested in compensation. I wanted it removed, rerouted legally, properly, and I gave them 30 days before I escalated it. And there was silence on the line for a second before he let out a small laugh and said I should think carefully about starting a fight I could not finish. Then he hung up. That night, I did not sleep much. I kept thinking about the water, the smell, the pipe under the ground like a secret artery feeding something I was never meant to see. And by morning, I had already decided I was not going to let it sit. I started pulling records, county filings, permits, anything I could find. And what I discovered did not just confirm my suspicion, it made it worse, because there was paperwork for an easement. Except it came after construction had already begun, and the signature on it was supposed to be mine, but I had never seen it in my life. I just sat there looking at that document thinking about how casually something like that could be forged. How easily a piece of paper could turn private land into a disposal route. And that was the moment I realized this was not a mistake, it was a system, and I was already inside it whether I agreed or not. And that is where everything really began to change, because once I knew what they had done, I stopped being just a landowner and became a problem they could not ignore. And in the next part, one will tell you exactly what happened when I stopped asking nicely and started pulling every lever I had. I still remember the exact moment I stopped feeling like this was something I could solve with a phone call or a polite letter. It was sitting at my kitchen table at maybe 2 a.m., staring at that forged easement document again and again, like if I looked long enough it would start making sense. But it never did. It just sat there on the screen like proof that someone had decided my land was optional. The weird thing is, I was not even shaking at that point. I think I was past shock. It was more like this cold clarity settling in, the kind you do not ask for, where you realize nobody is coming to fix this for you. The next morning I drove into the county office myself, not angry at first, just focused, asking for everything they had on Cedar Ridge Estates, permits, environmental reports, utility routing, anything tied to that development. The clerk actually hesitated when I said the name, just a fraction of a second too long, and that told me more than anything else. It took hours of waiting, filing requests, sitting in plastic chairs under fluorescent lights that made everything feel worse, but eventually I got access to enough records to see the shape of what they had done. They had submitted an easement request after construction had already started, claimed it was essential infrastructure, and attached my signature on a scanned document that was not mine, not even close if you knew how I signed things. When I pointed that out to a county supervisor, she went quiet in a way that felt official, like she had suddenly realized this had crossed a line she could not casually step over. She told me the request had already been rejected once, but the system flagged continued usage of the route as unresolved enforcement, and that was the first time I heard the words unauthorized utility passage, which is a polite way of saying someone is dumping something through your property illegally and hoping you never notice. I left that office with copies in my hands and a kind of strange pressure behind my eyes, not quite anger yet, more like something building. When I called Cedar Ridge again, this time I asked for their director, not the manager, and I got transferred to a man named Richard Halston, who sounded like he spent most of his life talking people down without ever actually solving anything. I explained everything: the pipe, the creek, the forged easement, the county rejection. And there was a pause on his end that lasted just long enough for me to hear him breathing. Then he said something I will never forget. He said, "Evan, let's not turn this into something bigger than it needs to be." And I almost laughed because I realized in that moment they already knew it was big, they just hoped I did not. I told him there was no version of this where it stayed small, and that they had 30 days to reroute or I would escalate it to environmental enforcement and press charges for fraud, and that is when the tone changed completely. He stopped sounding tired and started sounding sharp, controlled, and a little irritated, like I had stepped outside the role they expected me to play. He said, off the record, that I should consider a settlement, something to make this go away quietly, because legal battles could get expensive and slow. And then he actually said the word inconvenience again, like that was still the framing they were using for a sewage line running under my land. I told him I did not want money, I wanted it fixed, and he said we will see what we can do, which is corporate language for nothing will happen unless you force it. That night, I could not stop thinking about how long it had already been happening without me knowing. 2 years of waste moving through my soil, through the creek I drank from, through the land I thought I understood. So I stopped waiting. I contacted the county environmental health department, then the state EPA office, then a small environmental law group that usually dealt with rural contamination cases, and I laid everything out: documents, photos, the pipe location, water discoloration reports I had started collecting myself. At first I thought it would take weeks for anything to happen, But I underestimated how quickly things move when you use the right words like contamination pathway and unauthorized discharge into natural water systems. Because within 7 days, inspectors were on site. I remember watching them from a distance one morning, trucks parked near the edge of Cedar Ridge, people in reflective vests moving with clipboards and sample kits. And for the first time, I saw something in that development that was not controlled, not polished, not part of their brochure. Meanwhile, I started doing something I still think about carefully, because I knew I had legal standing now, and I knew exactly where that pipe crossed my land. And I also knew what happens when someone uses your property for an illegal utility line. It gives you rights most people do not realize they have until it is too late. So I hired a contractor, not some dramatic revenge setup, just a licensed excavation crew, and I told them to expose the line where it crossed my creek boundary, nothing more. When they dug, it did not feel cinematic at first. It just felt real, dirt moving, roots snapping, the slow reveal of something that was never meant to be seen. And then the pipe appeared again, thicker than I expected, wrapped in old insulation and buried deep enough that it was clearly not accidental. The foreman looked at me and said quietly, "You sure about this?" And I said I was not breaking anything that belonged to them. I was exposing something that never had permission to be here. Then I made the decision that changed everything. I told them to build a containment barrier at the crossing point, an earth dam, fully within my property line, fully legal under emergency environmental protection due to suspected contamination. I remember standing there while they finished it, watching the creek slow, then redirect, like the land itself was holding its breath. I did not know exactly what would happen next, but I knew one thing. Whatever was moving through that pipe was not going to pass through my land quietly anymore. And when it finally backed up, it did not stay hidden. It found its way back to where it came from. And that is when Cedar Ridge Estates realized I was not bluffing, because what came next turned their perfect little community into something they were never prepared to deal with. I did not see the first overflow happen with my own eyes. I only heard it, which honestly made it worse in a strange way. Because sound travels different out there in the valley, it carries through trees and open land, like it has nothing to lose. And that morning I heard shouting from a distance, not words at first, just panic, sharp and broken. The kind of noise people make when something they trusted stops behaving the way it is supposed to. I was standing outside my cabin with a coffee in my hand when my phone started ringing nonstop, unknown numbers. Then finally the county inspector I had met just a few days earlier, and all he said was, "You need to stay clear of the creek area. We have a serious containment issue," and I did not even have to ask what he meant. What I did not expect was how fast it escalated once the system had nowhere left to go. Cedar Ridge had built their entire sewage flow assuming that pipe would always carry everything away quietly under my land like it was invisible. But now that flow had resistance, real physical resistance, and systems like that do not just stop, they push back. By mid-morning, I could see activity from the ridge line, trucks moving fast, maintenance crews running in and out of gated sections, and then the smell reached me again, but stronger this time. No longer something in the background. Now it was impossible to ignore. I stayed back on my property, not interfering, just watching, because at that point everything I needed was already in motion. Later that day I got the call from Richard Halston again, and I could tell immediately something had changed because his voice was not controlled anymore. It was tight, frustrated, almost desperate in a way he was trying not to show. He said, "Evan, we have a situation," and I remember thinking how polite that word was for what I was already imagining. I told him I assumed the situation was the illegal pipeline operating through my land, and there was a long silence before he finally admitted they were experiencing backflow into multiple areas of the community infrastructure, including storm drainage and low elevation zones near their recreational facilities. I did not say anything for a moment. I just let that sit there, because the reality of it was finally catching up to them in a way paperwork never could. Then came the moment everyone remembers if they were there, even if they only saw it secondhand, the summer event. Cedar Ridge had planned a large community gala at their resort pool, something they had been advertising for weeks. White tents, live music, catered food, families dressed like it was a magazine photo shoot. And for a while that evening, everything probably felt perfect to them, until it did not. I was not inside the development. I was a quarter-mile away on my land. But even from that distance, I could see the movement, people shifting, then clustering, then stopping altogether, like the rhythm of the event had broken. What I heard later from one of the county staff who was on site was that the first sign was discoloration in the pool water, then pressure issues in the lower drainage system. And then it all happened at once, a failure in containment that sent contaminated backflow into the pool infrastructure during the middle of the event. By the time anyone understood what was happening, people were already in it, standing in what had been a resort-style centerpiece moments earlier, and then becoming something no one wanted to describe out loud. The evacuation was chaotic, not dramatic in a cinematic way, but messy and real, people grabbing children, slipping, yelling, staff trying to shut systems down that were already overwhelmed. I did not celebrate that moment, not because I felt bad for them, but because it was the first time I fully understood the scale of what they had done to my land before I ever reacted. That night Richard called again, and this time there was no corporate tone left at all, just exhaustion. He said, "We need to resolve this immediately, whatever it takes," and I told him it was simple: reroute the system legally, clean the contamination properly, and acknowledge the unauthorized use of my property in writing. He did not argue anymore. Within weeks, state environmental enforcement issued fines, construction orders, and mandatory remediation requirements. Cedar Ridge had to fund a proper treatment solution they had avoided from the beginning because it cost too much to build in the first place. The irony was not lost on me. They had tried to save money by routing their problem through my land, and ended up paying far more than they ever would have if they had done it right from day one. Eventually, they offered me a settlement, enough to more than cover what I had invested in the property, and then some, plus formal restoration of the creek. I accepted, but I did not remove the dam until every last section of pipe was confirmed rerouted and every test came back clean. The creek started running clear again slowly, like it was relearning itself, and I remember sitting there one evening listening to it, thinking about how quiet things can become after something loud finally ends. Cedar Ridge never really recovered from it, not financially, not socially, and definitely not reputationally, and I do not think they ever expected one piece of private land to become the reason their entire system collapsed. If I am honest, I do not know if what I did was justice or just consequences unfolding naturally once pressure had nowhere left to go, and I still think about that sometimes. So I will ask you the same question I ask myself. In a situation like this, where does responsibility actually begin, and where does it end? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you want more real-life land dispute stories like this, subscribe because there are more coming than you would expect.